Thank you, everyone, for being live with us today. Welcome to today's CG Talk, Friday, July 17, 2020. The pipeline problem is a myth. Black and brown creatives exist. I am one of them, with Antonio Garcia, whom I will introduce in just a moment. I'm Phil Terry. I'm delighted we are hosting this conversation with Antonio today. I first saw him give this talk in Toronto in mid-February of this year, just before the lockdowns. In fact, he and I were both speaking at an art and design conference that was organized by our wonderful fellow council member, Pamela Hilborn. The theme of the conference was inclusive design. Antonio gave a great talk. You're really in for a treat. And I spoke about the inclusive art movement I started 10 years ago called Slow Art Day. I also used it as an opportunity to be public for the first time with my gender-bending, non-conforming ways. In fact, here's a drawing of me that day that a good friend who designed, hang on a second, let me show you this, that a good friend of mine designed, let's see, am I not, okay, sorry, that a good friend designed. She actually was a speaker at the conference. She designed the first gender-neutral Barbie dolls, and she'll be giving a talk later this year to our community. But here's what she drew. That's me on that day. This fabulous dress that I bought at this gender-neutral store in New York called the Fluid Project, which sadly has shut down. She didn't capture my acrylic nails, but Antonio got to see them in person. All right, so when I talk to white internet leaders today, they are frantic to know what to do. And they're somewhat traumatized by the realization that they have not successfully recruited Black or brown professionals. Many believe it's a pipeline problem. Antonio would say, no, it's not a pipeline problem, that's a myth. He's going to help us understand this myth and what can be done to not only puncture it, but to change how most internet companies are almost entirely white. Certainly at the leadership level, but often throughout. Let me tell you a little bit about Antonio. He's a good friend. He was a council member. He left the councils actually back, I think it was 2017, Antonio, is that right?
I think so.
In that neighborhood.
That's
You
right.
took a leap of faith into a sabbatical to develop your own podcast brand, Dadwell and Company, which focused on dads who also happen to be makers, artists, and designers. And how you and your audience struck the elusive balance between, career and fatherhood. You have two kids, right? Javier, who's 5, and Amaya, who's a year and a half, I think. And through that work, as well as all of your roles as a design leader at Right Point, at Northern Lab, which was Northern Trust's internal innovation accelerator, and other companies, as well as your now current role as group experience director for Table XI, you've done a lot, Antonio. You've led and you've designed great products and services, but also led a lot of the conversations around design ethics, social innovation practice, design and diversity and inclusion, and of course, allyship. You've also served as a mentor, an educator, a lecturer at Northwestern's Siegel, Design Institute and designation. And you previously taught customer discovery as a part of the University of Chicago's Polsky Center for Entrepreneurship. You've been long involved with AIGA Chicago, that's the American Institute of Graphic Arts, which is the preeminent professional association for designers. And you were a VP of Diversity Inclusion for AIG Chicago, and now you're co-president. You're also a frequent contributor to, again, a lot of these conversations. You're gonna speak for 40 minutes or so, and then we'll do a Q&A. And I encourage people who are with us live to just put into the chat your questions or responses. I might pick those up and bring them into the conversation while he's talking, or we might wait until the end.
Perfect.
So thank you for being here, Antonio. It's really a treat
My pleasure.
To have you share, I think, this wonderful point of view in this talk.
Thank you very much. I'm glad to be here, Phil. And the topic is something we've been kind of talking a lot about as friends, but just like out in the world. How do we do we begin to solve for this?
Yeah.
And so this conversation is as much a little my own story, and then like practical things that people can put into play right away.
Yeah.
So I'll get into it if you're ready.
Let's go.
All right. Let me share my screen. There we go. So yeah, this idea of the pipeline problem. In other words, we would hire more Black and brown creative people if we just knew where they were. Maybe this field is such that they're hard to find, or they're just not that many of them out there.
Yeah.
And that's just not true. It's certainly a white dominated field, design. But to say that you don't know where these folks are, I think is kind of stepping aside from the work, which is to find these folks and to put them into positions where they can be seen, which I think begets more creatives to pursue those sorts of positions. So let's get going. I think anyone is in a position, whether you're in a leadership role or not, to begin to address some of the disparities in the design profession. I think everyone is in some position of power to influence and affect change. And I think the difference is usually access, reach, or support. That's usually what decides whether someone feels equipped or not to do this kind of thing. So I'll talk through some examples from AIGA Chicago, where I led diversity and inclusion efforts for the last 3 years, and just other things I've been collecting in the space because people ask. And so I feel like I should get my resources together. But throughout this conversation, these two ideas, these two concepts of intersectionality and social identity, which sometimes I think get conflated. And the distinction is, intersectionality is a theory developed in 1989 by Professor Kimberly Williams Crenshaw, an American scholar in the field of critical race theory, which essentially states that there are different forms or systems of oppression, and the way that they intersect, the way that they overlap, is an important thing to understand. Whereas social identity is just how we identify across all kinds of dimensions, as you can see in this social identity wheel. And we don't always feel these identities at the same strength or level day to day. Depending on context and who we're with, we may feel particularly close to our racial or ethnic identity. Another day, we may feel particularly close to our age as an identifier. And that's normal. And those shift and change based on context and the people around us and the situation we're in. So, in this case, I feel particularly Latino. It's how I was introduced. It's something that matters a lot to me. And if we're talking about, representation in the design field, I can't not acknowledge that. I've talked about this kind of thing closer to National Hispanic Heritage Month, which is split between September and October. And I bring it up just because the importance of declaring a history or heritage month as acknowledgement of your social identity is quite profound. It matters deeply to me that it's recognized. And it continues to evolve, even our own language to describe, is it Hispanic? Is it Latino? Is it Latinx? How do we talk about these things? You don't need to be embarrassed or afraid if you don't know how. It's important to do the research on your own and to learn. I prefer Latinx.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Because it solves for the gendered, Spanish language, right? Latino, Latina. Latinx is everybody. And if you only rely on Hispanic, which is sort of Spanish speaking, you ignore Latin identity in an enormous country like Brazil, where Spanish isn't the dominant language. So it's tricky, but I like Latinx as a term these days. Phil, were you going to say something?
No, I was just going to add that in the Southwest, there's also Chicano, Chicana.
Exactly. Yeah. It's a lot of subtle nuances between these things. I'm Puerto Rican, to be more specific. And so my ancestors are the indigenous people of the Caribbean, the Taino, which means noble and good. The actual tribe is the Arawak people. Borinquen described the people, which means, Borinquen described the island, Boricuas are the people, but when they met newcomers, that got inverted because the phrase Taino means noble and good. That's how they were greeted, to say, we are noble and good. And it was interpreted as, oh, that must be your names. And so we have an entire tribe of people that are misnamed just because of who encountered them and what was recorded. But we use these, the language of the Taino people all the time. The word barbacoa is barbecue. The word hamaca is hammock. The word huracan is hurricane. So we're using language of a tribe of people we may know very little about. Puerto Ricans are a mashup of African through the diaspora and slave trade, Spanish through the conquistadors, and Taino people. And so to be Puerto Rican is to be, in ways, all of those things, and none of those things at the same time. So yo soy Boricua, right? I am Puerto Rican. It's a territory of the United States. It's a commonwealth. It's actually the oldest colony in existence. And its citizens are citizens of the United States. Puerto Ricans are American. But its status as a commonwealth means we cannot vote for president. Yet we can be drafted and we can serve in the military. So therein lies the rub of disenfranchisement and systemic oppression, second-class citizenship, et cetera. My parents moved from Puerto Rico in the late 1940s, in their late teens. They met and married and started families in the States. And I sometimes imagine my grandparents in the early days, 1950s Chicago, as extras in the West Side Story, only they didn't need to wear brown face like all the actors did in this film. And my parents took me to see this play when I was in elementary school. And all I can remember is wanting to start a street gang of third graders.
Did you have a name?
I didn't have a cool name yet.
Okay.
But not long after they got married, my grandfather, Jose, went to fight in the Korean War as a member of the 65th Infantry. It was the only all-Latino unit in the history of the US, which is a polite way of saying it was the last segregated unit of the Army. My grandparents were incredibly entrepreneurial and hardworking. And when my grandfather returned, they started several businesses, and they moved their families around Chicago a lot in order to do that. And when my dad was born, my grandparents wanted to call him Miguel Angel, Michelangelo. But the nurses convinced them that Angel, as they pronounced it, was too effeminate for a boy's middle name, and suggested Anthony. And with his last minute suggestion and just feeling flustered and English not being his first language, my grandparents actually transposed the names on the form. And so my dad became Anthony Michael. And so my legal name is Anthony Michael Garcia Jr. And I've chosen Antonio to reclaim in ways my father's name. And so this idea of misnaming, right, from the Taino people to my father, et cetera, is a theme for me. So my mom and dad lived in Black and Puerto Rican neighborhoods on the south and west sides of Chicago. This is a turbulent time, kind of revolutionary, 60s and early 70s. The Young Lords were forming, inspired by their Black Panther counterparts. But there was no way my parents were going to be allowed to participate in anything like that, growing up in a strict Catholic household. So they escaped through music. And my mom loved R&B and soul, and my dad loved heavy metal. And my parents got married just after high school. My mom studied nursing. My dad declined a scholarship to Loyola University to work for Delta Airlines, where he continues to work today and is actually 9 days away from retirement. He spent his whole life in that organization, which I don't think they make them like that anymore. And they were young and liberal and in many ways assimilated. They moved to the northwest suburbs of Chicago, where I grew up. And it was around this time that my empty nester grandparents moved back to Puerto Rico. My mom's little sister moved in with us to finish up college. And so my Aunt Diane was like my cool older sister and exposed me to New Wave. And so like my parents, it was through music that I understood the world. And I found hip hop when I was 10 years old, when a cousin let me borrow the De La Soul mixtape that you see in the top corner, 3 Feet High and Rising. Puerto Rican parents always tell their kids about Roberto Clemente, the right fielder for the Pittsburgh Pirates, who was the first Latin American and Caribbean player to make it into the Baseball Hall of Fame. But when you're not good at baseball, I think if you ask a lot of artists and designers, they would say, you know, we just don't do sports. You need more than athletic heroes. Or Menudo. They weren't really cutting it for me either. You can see Ricky Martin in the bottom there. What a cutie. So I went looking for Puerto Rican heroes in hip hop, and I found them. I was thrilled to learn that Prince Whippa Whip from the Cold Crush Brothers and Grand Wizard Theodore and the Fantastic Five that he was Puerto Rican. And that meant that Puerto Ricans were part of hip hop right from the very beginning, which was incredibly important for me. And it was around this time in high school that or junior high, that I experienced racism in the most blunt form, when someone whose name I can still remember, we'll call him Steve, called me a spick. And it was the first time I'd ever heard that term. I had to ask my aunt what that meant. And also around that same time, a girlfriend's parents made her break up with me because they told her that Hispanics have different values than she and her family had. And I went by Tony at the time. And so maybe when you met me, you might have thought I was Italian, but then you heard my last name and you understood that I wasn't. And so suddenly I felt too brown for the white kids. And even though I spent nearly every summer in Puerto Rico, I never really learned to speak Spanish fluently. And so I was too white for the brown kids. And so in between is where I've existed my whole life as kind of a cultural chameleon and double agent, and a bit of an anomaly. And so back to my quest for identity and trying to find myself through music, I got a subscription to the Source magazine and got hooked on the New York Poets movement and kept looking for any Puerto Rican heroes I could find, even those who weren't technically Puerto Rican, like John Leguizamo, who's also Colombian. And that's the thing about a lack of representation. You become an obsessive collector. You're in a constant state of search and dissatisfaction, really. It's these little quick hits of pride or power-ups, but they never totally satiate you. And you're always hungry. You're always looking for the next ornament to add to your menagerie, the next award for your trophy case, the next fleeting image of a potential future self. And thankfully, I found community when I got to high school. I joined the United Young Sisters and Brothers, which was my first affinity group. And it mostly felt like a youth organization for Black and brown kids who hated high school in the suburbs. And while I didn't feel particularly strong about either of those two viewpoints, I felt found for the first time. And there's something about feeling found. It's a powerful sensation. In ways, that sense of belonging, whether it's in collaborative gain or something else, I think is what we're all seeking, especially those whose identities put them on the fringe or the margins of the mainstream and dominant forces. And then we moved to the South, and I felt racism again. My dad's job with Delta relocated him to Atlanta, which is their headquarters, and we moved to Peachtree City, Georgia. And I felt it in an all new, in my face kind of way. People using the N-word with a hard G. And yeah, I wanted to get out of there really bad. And I thought that would happen with school, but then I got a good scholarship. And then I ended up staying longer. And I attended the Atlanta College of Art, which actually doesn't exist anymore. It was acquired by Savannah College of Art and Design. But it was there that I found a lot more people like me. And in that sense, it wasn't necessarily more Latinos, it was more creative people. And that was a powerful feeling as well. You know, my parents were always really supportive. They put me in Park District art classes, anything that they could afford. Saturday classes at the Art Institute. My dad would take me to comic book conventions and all kinds of things. And so it was no surprise that I would pursue art. But I think for a lot of immigrants and first generation kids, art and design careers are non-starters. You know, you can imagine parents saying, you know, I didn't come all this way and bust my ass for you to go study art. You know, like, what? No, like, you're going to be a doctor, you're going to be an attorney, you're going to be an engineer, right? And that's why we came. And so I found all kinds of artists who were like me through art school. Jean-Michel Basquiat, who's Puerto Rican and Haitian, Lee Quinones, who's Puerto Rican, Andy Cruz of House Industries, Carlos Segura, who's Cuban, Pablo Stanley. And I started to see myself in other people and go, that's what I want to be. So art school for 4 years, returned to Chicago, joined Firebilly Design, where I led brand strategy for the studio, and it was good design for good reason. So all of our clients were in the social sector space and for nonprofits. I moved to Humboldt Park, which is a Puerto Rican neighborhood in Chicago. I began to volunteer with the Puerto Rican Cultural Center. And I was feeling really good about contributing with design skills to these communities. I was exposed to design thinking when I joined Gravity Tank, which is not dissimilar from IDEO or Frog or Jump Associates. I helped build an interaction team there. I developed our social innovation practice, borrowing from Firebilly, and our healthcare practice. And I started teaching at Northwestern and University of Chicago in the Institute of Design. And then I joined Northern Trust in the innovation lab, where I started code switching for the first time, which is a thing. For those that aren't aware with of the term, it's the idea that for all kinds of reasons, you don't bring your full self to work, and you subvert who you are, and not just a difference between, you know, business casual and buttoned up professional, but you change up the way you talk, the way you interact, who you are. And it felt really wrong to be doing that in my late 30s. A dear friend of mine passed away from cancer around the same time. Trump got elected, and I just found myself in this very interesting state, and I knew I needed to do something. And so I got involved in AIGA in diversity and inclusion work, and I made plans for my departure from Northern Trust. And even though I left the bank and I joined the leadership of a large digital agency, RightPoint, I still felt conflicted and kind of frustrated with the lack of diversity in our field, and broken hiring processes and poor recruitment practices, and just leadership across the board, not just at RightPoint, but just everywhere, that was doing very little to address D&I in a meaningful way. So here begins the juicy bits, the news you can use, things I tried to implement at AIGA. I'll pause here just to get a read on if there's anything in the chat, or if I should just keep going.
I think you can keep going. I mean, but I do want to say thank you for sharing that path, and also clearly your emotionality, you know, giving that to us as you're talking about this experience. Yeah.
Yeah, in Toronto, I was a blubbering mess. Phil can attest to it. Someone had to give me a
It was
box
fine.
of
It
Kleenex
was great. It was great.
Yeah.
And I just also want to acknowledge that Charlie, who works on our team, is a young Chicana, and you know, is very excited about today's talk and the work that you've been doing, as am I.
Thank you.
All right, so keep going, Antonio. Let's
Yeah,
talk about this. Yeah.
Yeah, as Phil mentioned, AIGA is the largest, oldest professional organization of design. It's about 106 years old, has over 70 chapters across the country, about 18,000 members or so. Chicago's the second, sometimes third, depending on the time, largest chapter of the organization. And AIGA Chicago never had a dedicated board member focused on D&I. I was its first. There was a task force that had been doing work for a number of years at the national level, but we really weren't seeing it represented in a dedicated way with voting rights at chapter board level. So I didn't have anything to base it on. And so this is how I started. I talked with a lot of people, and I knew that I needed to do some kind of benchmarking, some sort of reporting to say, okay, here's baseline. The day that I stepped into the role, this is where we were, so that over the next couple of years, we could continue to sort of test and learn, and then see how we were performing. So I talked to past board members, I talked to ex-members, I talked to D&I leaders in other industries to get as smart as I could quickly. And I learned that there were sort of 5 areas to focus on. Benchmarking, as I mentioned, establishing common language and shared understanding within the board. It's interesting how tense and nervous people are to even use certain words for fear of offending somebody or getting it wrong. You know, it was not uncommon for me to hear like, yeah, we've got to do more to diversify the board, you know, recruit Black people. And I was like, that's funny. Why did you just whisper Black people? Like, there's nothing to be afraid of. Like, say that out loud. You know, that is great. You know, it's important to say these things to be more comfortable with the words of this work and get past the, you know, the nomenclature so that we can focus on the effort. Yeah, I needed to form a...
Antoine addressed that. I think you were in attendance at his talk last month, right? Talking about teaching people how to talk and what words to use, and that of course you don't know. Many people don't. Yeah. Yeah.
And there's nothing wrong with that ignorance if you're working on it, right? So I had to form a committee. I knew I couldn't do this alone, and that we'd need to meet semi-regularly to do this, and that we had to own our mistakes as a chapter. We had to just be bold and recognize that and respond with empathy, not refute these things. And we were going to need to collaborate across teams and sectors. And I also spent a lot of time at events, just trying to soak it up. And eventually I was showing up at all these events and I was being invited onto the panels. And I was like, not the guy yet to do that, but I did it. And I shared what little bits I was collecting, which sort of built momentum for me personally.
Yeah.
So I mentioned forming a committee. The committee needed to be as diverse as we are trying to make the field. And so it took me a while, but I wanted to find people that represented lots of different social identities to lead that work. So here was the initial crew. And we had turnover. Like every year, we would sort of get a fresh batch of folks interested in the work. And we wanted to put together a plan or a framework or whatever. And I was racking my brains on how to create one. And then I just started looking around and I realized there's already so many. And there's nothing wrong with borrowing existing frameworks. Like it's silly to build that from scratch when people have already done great work around this. So acknowledging those people for the work, donating or paying for those frameworks, and then putting them to use or remixing them and adapting them for yourself. So year one, this is what we did. We established a baseline. We started to use culturally competent language in all of our programming and events. And we were trying to come up with new metrics for how we'd measure success. And we needed to partner with somebody. So we worked with Culture AMP, which focuses a lot on culture within organizations. And they, at the time, had a free D&I survey that we changed the language, you know, so instead of employees, we made it members, that sort of thing. But we launched it pretty much as is. And that really helped us better understand the composition of our community and where we needed to improve. We started to integrate D&I into everything that we did. So it wasn't just a separate side project. It wasn't just a list of special D&I events. Every event was going to have a diversity and inclusion component to it. Every panel was going to be looked at and built with that lens. Really simple things like all the board members updated their name tags and their email signatures to include their pronouns, just to begin to normalize some of these ideas. Simple demonstrations of a new mindset and the effort that we wanted to put in. And then we came up with new metrics, like how would we know we were successful? How how would we know when we made progress or when we had setbacks? And so we did that through a number of means, collecting from our community. And we knew we needed to change up the format. We couldn't just do the same kinds of things. We couldn't host the events along, red line demarcations within the city. Not everything has to happen in the loop. What happens if we start hosting our events on the south and west side of Chicago, finding partnerships to do that? It doesn't always have to be, one established design leader on a stage talking, sage on the stage. Like, why not change the format and include people in different ways? So here's a few examples of what that looked like. The first event that I worked on was Design Pride. It was a very intimate setting. You can see here, it was hosted at Morningstar. Oftentimes we would push for big events, lots of seats. And in this case, we said, no, what if we did something really small? It was intimate. We had, queer designers reflecting on the industry through their professional and personal lenses. And so the lineup, the host, everyone was part of the LGBTQ community. It was really important for us that the host be as well. I'll get through these takeaways quickly. These are just sort of
great stuff, though. It's
things
really
we learned.
Helpful. Yeah.
We launched a series called On the Daily, which timed itself with History and Heritage Months throughout the year. The idea being, it isn't just during Black History that we will celebrate Black designers. We will do this on the daily. And so it's great. We basically turned our Instagram feed over to different creative people every cycle, and reposted their work and celebrated their work. And so it coincided with these History and Heritage Months, and it spotlighted underrepresented talent in Chicago. And we took some of those same folks, and then we did longer form interviews, and we turned that Instagram series into a podcast series so we could go deeper in these conversations and talk about how their identities influence the creative practice and that sort of thing. I think one of the best things was that we prioritized people who had very few Instagram followers. Like, that was the point. It's not like, who are the all-stars in any of these categories, but like, who are the people you need to know and don't yet. And just this idea of equipping people rather than empowering. We say empowering a lot, and there's kind of superiority laced into that these people are without power, and I have to grant them power. And so to get out of that sort of patriarchal idea, the idea of equipping people, right? The people already have the power. They just need access, resources, that sort of thing. The Culture Amp and Typeform surveys that we launched were super informative. They shaped our town hall called This is Chicago. And we were honest about the feedback we received. We put it back out on Instagram and we owned it, real complaints like, how would you describe AIGA to a friend or colleague? It's white, around 30, professional designers drinking craft beer. I was like, oh no, we got a lot of perception issues to address. Clearly that person hadn't been to an event in a long time because we don't even have a budget for craft beer. So that was just emphatically false. But even if one person—
It was the perception, right? So
exactly. Even if one person believed this,
right,
it was important for us to address, and that was their truth. And so it didn't matter what we had done, if they still felt that way, we weren't doing it right. So this is a picture of me, just human shield, taking feedback from the community. Mm-hmm. And it was great. I mean, people brought it and we owned it, and, we had our work cut out for us, and we made the entire year of programming after that. Every single thing we did was aimed at chipping away at this perception and earning people's trust back. So it was hugely powerful, combined with those surveys I mentioned.
Yeah.
These are just little, kind of strategic takeaways for how we fielded it. We had an event around photographing creatives of color, and to do that in a way that captures complexion and skin tone, which to an untrained photographer is often difficult to do when you have a lot of melanin in your skin. So we had a person of color shoot photographs of people of color as free headshots for LinkedIn. And while you were waiting to get your headshot made, we had a couple of other content creators and writers standing by to rework people's resumes and LinkedIn profiles. Yeah.
Huh. It's fantastic.
Yeah, it was hugely
You
moving.
continuing to do this, by the way, this particular thing?
Yeah, the idea is to do it every year and to try to time it around different events. So we do intend to continue to do it. Is hugely successful. Yeah, totally free. Lots of nuance here. I'll just keep punching through it to get to some things that people can do. So HBR has this great article. I believe Brittany has the links to all of this stuff, and we'll share it. But they were talking with the Center for Talent Innovation, and they said there's 3 things that really decide whether or not people have a feeling of belonging. To make sure that they're included. Right? It isn't enough to just be diverse. Inclusion is the reason why you feel found and that you stay. And so these were the 3 mechanisms that the center said are mission critical to doing this, and that the drivers for this are actually quite simple. Leaders who make space or are representative themselves, an authentic approach to this, not a PR approach, real opportunities for networking and visibility so that the diverse talent you've recruited now has paths for growth and development. And so that sounds overwhelming to a lot of places. And thankfully, there's a lot of great consultants, more than ever now. There might be a wait list at this point, who will help you get there, right? And so I was a partner in one called Colored, which sadly is no longer in operation, but my colleague and I, worked to develop an approach to how to diversify creative teams. And one of the indicators of readiness that Teresa Stewart, who co-founded Colored, arrived at is executive sponsorship, which is different than mentorship. Mentorship is advice, and sponsorship is advantage. A reporting process, and then a non-retaliation clause, right? Like, I got to know I'm safe if I'm going to bring up some of these issues. Now, getting to that point of pipeline, the whole title of this thing, there are more directories than ever, just chock full of amazing talent, sliced by different social identities. So there's LatinxWhoDesign.com, which is your one-stop shopping for amazing Latinx talent. Blacks Who Design, People of Craft, which is people of color in all sorts of creative fields, the Queer Design Club, Women Who Design, and they continue to emerge. So for anyone who says, oh, I wish I could find more talent like fill in the blank, they're here, thousands of them, with a lot of detail on, where they live and their links to portfolios. So there's no excuse for not being able to source this talent yourself. And there's a lot of tools that exist to aid in writing more equitable job descriptions, to think differently about where you post these things. So I have all these links again that I handed to Brittany, but Blendor, Lever, Greenhouse, Textio. I'm going to punch through these because you'll get them. Some of these use AI, some of these use real humans, but they're about diversifying candidate pools more strategically. And there's just a ton of events. A new one that just popped up was Where Are All the Black Designers? It was all virtual right now during COVID. It was profound. It was amazing to see the talent and ideas. There's no shortage of stuff. That's why I say it's a myth. If you want it, it's there. There are a lot of projects, a lot of initiatives, especially for diversifying tech. Dear Tech People is a great site. And then the last bit is in the inverse. If you are on the margins and you are feeling under supported, there's a great article by Alan Henry from the New York Times that gives real strategy for how to navigate these things. I won't spend any more time on it, but the key points are trusting your gut, not allowing yourself to be gaslit in these situations, managing up, protecting boundaries, and documenting the hell out of all of these things. And so I'll just close by saying, in addition to the design community, I'm thinking a lot about my kids. and how do I ensure that they have their own Puerto Rican identity, their own Puerto Ricanidad, and that they find their own Latinx heroes, in whatever career they choose. And part of that searching and wanting, I think, is the discovery, right? That it's built in. They have multiple ethnicities. They're Puerto Rican and Jewish, these rich intersectional identities. And so I was thrilled when I learned that that Bruno Mars is a Puerto Rican, and U.S. Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez descends from Spanish Jews, because it means that I have mounting evidence that my daughter will be a leader and my son will be a rock star. So thank you.
Awesome. And I want to say, in terms of the events that are coming up, there's a woman named Roz Francouz Harris who leads recruiting at HBO Max, an African-American lesbian woman who also runs a company called Y'all Hiring, which is both a podcast and they have an event. I don't know if you know or run into her, but she's doing some great stuff too. So we'll include that, and she's going to give a talk next month here to the councils. So thank you, Antonio. It's really touching. I'm always moved by how you combine the personal and the political, the local and the national, if you will, or global.
Thank you.
And, on that point, there's so many good things that you said, but certainly documenting everything. This is one of the things that I often coach young women, young Latinx women, young African-American women, and others that I coach is in their jobs to really document when they get, good words from their boss and so on. Because what I found happens often is that, they'll get all kinds of great feedback, they'll do great work, they'll even exceeds expectations, but then they won't get a raise or a title change. And then they're like sort of, without the documentation that they're in with the documentation, they can usually change something.
That's right.
In terms of questions, so one of our members typed into the chat, he lives in Chicago and his musically and visually creative sophomore high school student just came out as bi and wanted to know, does AIGA have any high school recruiting efforts, outreach programs for creative kids in high school?
Yeah, that's a great question. There are. It's more sporadic. I think it begins closer to college, where people have student chapters at different creative institutions. But yeah, we've been talking a lot about how we reach even deeper down. I think that's thinking about high schools as the farm team, right, or the starter league. I think is really important.
Let's connect you with, his name is Gonzo. We'll connect you with him.
Yeah,
maybe,
I think also talking with parents, like helping parents understand the paths, I think is almost more important. Like, I think the kids get it.
Right.
Like, I want to be an artist. I want to be a designer. And the parents are like, what?
Yeah.
So there's opportunity to educate there too.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah.
That's great. We have a number of great people live with us. I'd love to, call on them, maybe have them join us with a comment or conversation. Summer, may I call on you, promote you to a panelist and have you join us? Okay, great. I just promoted you to panelist, so you should come up here.
Hi, Summer.
Hi.
Hey there. Hey. So this is Summer Koide, who is a senior director of new ventures at Target, and is a wonderfully creative and creative leader, and did a great session about a month ago. Was it, Summer?
About a month ago, yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, what are you thinking as Antonio is talking?
I think personally, I think a lot about how I can, or what I should be doing about building out my own professional network, and how I have a more diverse professional network. And You know, I appreciate so much that you create space for people to be awkward and ignorant about asking these questions and not knowing how to get started. And it feels very embarrassing to ask questions like that.
Yeah.
But how do you think about, you know, those of us that are in a hiring position who, you know, we can't put all of the responsibility and the burden on our recruiting partners, right? Like there's some level of responsibility we each have. And how do you think about that for folks that might be in hiring positions?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great question. Because I think some of it is just putting yourself where those folks already are. We see it in our own chapter efforts. We know there's creative pockets all over the city where Black and brown people are leading all kinds of interesting projects, initiatives, groups. If we don't, you know, ask for an invite just to be present there, there's no way we could ever ask them to come and join us, right? And so I think the traditional places that you post job recs should be like critically scrutinized. You know, like if you're getting the same kinds of folks, it could be because you're putting those posts in the same sorts of places.
And the traffic is different there than in other
Yeah,
places. Yeah, that's a great
exactly.
idea.
Yeah. And I think looking for, like, I default to design schools, but looking for, you know, diverse design programs and non-traditional programs. So not even always degree programs. Like more than ever, people are self-taught. They're attending boot camps and these kind of, you know, non-degree programs, and they're just as amazing, if not more, because they're not sort of caught up in the orthodoxy of the old institutions. But if you're just looking for like, oh, where's your BFA or your MFA as a creative person, and someone says, well, I actually never got one of those. Well, now they're not even in the running, right? Because not that that's always a filter, but I think a lot of times people will recruit out of, you know, recognized institutions when there's a lot of great young talent, just, you know, in other places. So those are two pieces that I think are just, they exist, and you just need to hunt them down and try to be present there. And, you know, when you have recruiting fairs or those kinds of more public events, making sure that those are promoted in spaces that, you know, marginalized creative people are going to find, which may be, you know, not the usual suspects, you know, not the normal spaces. Like, oh, let's put this event on I don't know, an AIGA space or an Adobe space, because that's naturally where people are. What are some other places to get creative with that? I think is interesting.
Yeah, I mean that's even just thinking about it that way, right? Thinking about it more about the destinations and the gathering places where the folks are, as opposed to how to attract them into where I'm at. Thank you.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. All right, cool. It's great to see you, Summer. Thanks
Nice
for
to see you too.
coming in. All right. Next, I'm going to bring in Carrie Cooper, promote you to panelist. So Carrie's a longtime friend, had been moderator and member of the councils. She actually just joined the board of Pacific Gas and Electric, PG&E, the company that is that just went through bankruptcy and fires, and she's there to help hopefully right the ship. And has held a number of roles, from, you know, companies like Rothy's, where she was president, to Walmart, ModCloth, and many other places, and has children of color. And I was thinking of you when he was talking about his Puerto Rican Jewish children, because you have African American Jewish children.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. What are you thinking? What are you thinking about?
Well, first, I just want to say thank you. I appreciate your authenticity and what you're doing. I think one of the things that I hope has come out of all of whatever we could call this awareness in the last couple of months has been, I think people are being much more authentic on who they are, and I think that actually lends itself to permanent change. My sister-in-law did a great talk on LinkedIn, and I felt like she was sitting across the dining room table from me, not like the normal kind of corporate shield that we all have where you're like, okay, well, this is what I'm supposed to be presenting. And I was thinking about, a friend of mine off of an LGBTQ group created this thing for African Americans to get into marketing and tech that was a Google Doc. It was just a Google Doc, and like you just put your name down and a Calendly link. And I've had, I think, 30 conversations over the last few weeks with people who have, I had a little worry of like, it's a bunch of white people making themselves feel better. Like, if you build it, will they come? And by the way, they do. And I've had conversations from like, product managers at high tech companies here to like entry level, associate's degrees program. It's like, and I love the hustle, right? The people who find it, it's interesting. And it really has brought me to like, it's not a pipeline problem. It's a, like, how do you expand your network? And by the way, how do we pay it forward with each other network? Cause it's not, I'm willing to open my network to people who are willing to reach out and find me. Right. But how you make that happen, I think is an interesting question. I appreciate, like, I'm looking forward to the link of, to all the links that you're going to send through. I think those are really valuable. And I guess I just would leave it back there as, how do you scale those? Like, this one thing that happened once, like, I want to make sure it continues. And I think that's the one thing I'm a little worried about is that, Black Lives Matter, Latinx Lives Matter, whatever it might be, comes along for a while and then dies down and we just go back to the way it was. So how do we keep it going?
Yeah. Oh man. That's a good one. I think we have to acknowledge the fatigue that comes with this kind of work, the way you're describing it, sort of anti-racism work, which I think sometimes is conflated with diversity and inclusion efforts, but they really should be seen as two distinct things, right? Like diversity and inclusion is a, I think a vision for making work spaces, belonging spaces. And I think anti-racism work is almost a higher order commitment, right? That is a life, that's life's work. So I think that's an important distinction to make. And then I think just recognizing like, there needs to be some forgiveness and empathy for the fatigue, because I don't think you can keep at it at the levels that we're seeing after George Floyd's murder in perpetuity. Like that is not sustainable. Like people will come apart, right? And so I think there has to be some rest built in to these efforts, but not allow it to sag to the point that we have another news cycle and we forget all about it. I believe that generationally, Gen Z and millennials, like they've inherited a world of shit from us. And they think very differently about it than we have.
They totally do. They provide me leadership all the time. I follow them.
Yeah, there's a real energy and expectation there that I think, Gen X is just sometimes a little more apathetic, or just, we're the slacker generation. Like I think we get worn out and we say, it is what it is, or we sort of, resign ourselves to some of these constructs as just like being permanent. And I think that there's an energy in young people and an expectation that like, no, my job is going to have this built in, or it's a non-starter for me. Right. I never felt that way when I came into work. It was like a bonus, nice to have, like, cool if that happens, but like, I certainly wouldn't demand it. And I think there's a demand here and an expectation here that is fundamentally different. And so I do think that it will continue because the energy is different, the expectation is different, and the proximity to peril is different, right? Like some of these people came up when, the housing crisis just started, and now we're in this other thing. Like they've never seen a good version. So they only know this mode. And so I'm hopeful.
It's depressing, right? Because then it's almost a generational thing of like, okay, well, you got to wait till the old Gen X's retire, or like, you know, I don't know. Yes, and I agree with you.
Yes,
and
yes.
it makes me feel like it's not going to be. That's a long-term change.
Yeah, I mean, but isn't all of this? I mean, this is.
Yeah.
It's long-term. And I mean, my answer to you, Carrie, is absolutely. There'll be a backlash and there'll be fatigue, right? So both of those things are going to happen. They're already happening. What are some long-term things? Like if I say to people, look, if you're serious and you're interested in this, then make a long-term commitment, and that's going to look like different levels of commitment at different moments. But start now, you know. I mean, I know I say to some people, like, you know, because I was a community organizer and I learned a lot of stuff from African-American activists back in the 80s. And it was very, very hard. But, you know, I'm now 30 years later, you know, I've read, I don't know, 200 books or something. I've done a lot of activities. So it's different for me to approach this than for most of our colleagues who are coming at this for the first time. You know, I mean, you are not, because of your family and the way that, you know, so you've been learning about this for 20 or 30 years. But most of the white colleagues that we have, that we went to business school with, et cetera, have not thought about this at all, actually. Maybe for 1 minute, and they've dismissed it, but now they're not. And we'll see. Not all of them will hang in there, but some of them will. And I see it as part of my job is to create long-term options and solutions for them to be involved. I mean, we had a class last night. We're doing these, Antonio, we're doing these Warren Buffett reading groups where we're teaching the basics of business and business finance and philosophy of business to teenagers. And our groups are now 50% African-American. And of the African Americans, and by the way, and African American and people of color, you know, Puerto Rican, Chicano, and of them, more than half are women. You know, and this, we're kind of, it's a bit by bit, but several of our classmates have signed up, and my expectation is that over time we're going to end up reaching thousands of people to teach them. And I'm particularly interested, by the way, in having young creative people learning enough about business so that they could, because part of the challenge creatives have in the business world is everything we've talked about today, but also not knowing the language of business and being able to talk to business people in a way that influences and changes hearts and minds. Anyway.
Yeah. And I guess I mentioned the young people, not as a cop out. We're like, and then they'll do the work and I'll be over here chilling.
Right.
I mention it as like, that gives me hope. Like when I am feeling the most low, I follow certain Instagram feeds just to be fed this energy by young people and be like, okay, good. Like I got to.
You should tell us the feeds you're following, by the way, Antonio. We should include that in the follow-up note. That would be great.
And that discomfort is like, that's the transition. That's the pain is the change, you know? So, the work's never going to be done like that. It isn't the point. Like the point should not be to eradicate racism or any other isms. Like, because if that's the point, we'll all reach a point where we go, it's impossible. These are insurmountable, twisted problems that we can't unwind. The point is to persist in spite of that, right? To not stop because it feels impossible. Like that to me is the work.
Yeah. Great. Well, Antonio, do you have a few more minutes in case people want to hang out?
Sure.
You need to run? Okay.
No, I'm
Thank you, Carrie. It's really good to see you.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks, Carrie.
So a number of people are still with us. Would love to have anyone else pop in and join us. Would anyone else like to do that? You could raise your hand or just put something in the chat. Karen Pasco, are you still with us? Let me know. Oh, great. Oh, it looks like she said she was happy to, but oh, there she is. Okay, great.
Right. It's you know, something about turning the video and the mute button on.
Right.
So thank you, Antonio, so much for this conversation. So I lead experience design at MasterCard across all of our digital payment capabilities. And I feel like I've been really kind of woken up and sort of taken by storm and I'm going through my awakening process with things I need to read and things I need to learn. And as a white female design leader, I'm from Detroit. So I'm actually super sensitive to a lot of issues around race and have good friends. But I think I've just been in my little tunnel vision of, oh, well, I really want to hire diverse teams, but I'm not really seeing that. So I think your talk has been really heartfelt and really timely. And I live in El Barrio in Manhattan. So if you come to town, I can take you for some great cuchifritos. So we have really been thinking a lot about systemic racism at MasterCard. We've come out really significant and strong with a statement around, markets, people, a lot of different things. The plan is actually really significant in terms of, doing some work there, but we didn't really feel comfortable in our design organization that was actually enough. So 2 of our Black team members are actually leading an initiative called Diversity by Design, and they're actually really junior into our organization, but wonderful leaders, right? Because leaders, it's not a level, it's about getting people behind you. Yeah. And so, we're so excited, and I mean, myself and my fellow leaders within the organization around really empowering them. So, every talk when the recording comes out, Phil, I've been sharing that with the team and really coaching them around it. So the initiative we are charging here, because when you work for a big company like MasterCard, you have HR systems and processes. And so we're doing a lot of work to actually shift to minority Black colleges and underrepresented institutions in our mix of building pipeline within our generalist business population. And that's always going to be the majority of MasterCard staff. But, I mean, building out big UX teams and design teams, your HR teams, God bless, mostly they're not all that helpful. So you really have to do your own work, really kind of cultivating a conversation with the community that's authentic, that's really resonating with people.
Like Summer was, like we were beginning to talk about with Summer at Target. Yeah.
Absolutely. And that is... so I think all of the sources that you provided is really wonderful. And I think what we really need to do is figure out where we're going to have partnerships with different organizations. So, maybe not too much more really to add into the conversation other than saying, Phil, thank you for bringing this conversation together. Really appreciate it. I think it's really timely. And thank you, Antonio, for really everything on your story. And I think this trailblazing, and I think this own up your mistakes, because we're not going to get everything right. And so, I mean, I'm on my journey. I've got 3 books that I'm working through between white fragility and how to become an anti-racist and, me and white supremacy. But also I'm really looking at this a lot from a historical and personal perspective, being from Detroit, where I was born in a very sensitive time, right around 2 race riots there. So also looking at my own personal history to really start framing out my future. And so, I love the timeliness of this, the resources that you're providing, and how I can go back to these young, wonderful, amazing emerging leaders that I've got on my team with some additional resources as they're really helping shape the conversation, really with the full support of the leadership, right? So really, really excited, and thank you so much.
Oh, my pleasure.
Antonio,
awesome
do you think it might make sense for you to talk with Karen or that team over there as a follow-up? I don't know.
Yeah,
I think what you did with the AIGA is such a great template for what a lot of organizations can do.
Yeah, happy to help. I think the idea of equipping people and giving them a platform, amplifying their efforts, really just putting resources behind it is like, that's the thing. That's the advantage that I think you've likely experienced in your own life, and what we need to turn around and do for other people. And some of that sometimes is stepping aside. I think when I think of the board of any one group, and you're starting to see this now, like people giving up their spots for other talent who wouldn't have likely been in there, is a really profound thing, to just make room, or to,
Yeah.
like you're doing, like working on yourself, reading, not making other people do the emotional labor of teaching you, I think is also really important. If you care about it, you'll hunt down the resources, you'll put in the work, you'll feel the discomfort. And if you're lazy about it, then you're like, hey, tell me why this is a problem so that I don't have to do it. It's like, that's not that person's job to make you,
Yeah,
to make you not
this is
racist.
not
Like,
knowledge
that's up to you.
acquisition. This is transformation, and you have to go
Yes.
through the experience yourself.
Yeah, that's
You can't
exactly right.
outsource that. Yeah.
So thanks, Karen, for sharing that.
Yeah.
I think that's important.
Yeah, it's
Great.
great to see you, Karen.
Yeah, great to see you too, Phil.
Yeah, thank you. All right, Antonio, I think we're going to wrap up, but really thank you so much, my friend. It's wonderful. Again,
Super.
and wonderful work, yes, that you have done at AIGA, and it's an example to the industry for how companies and organizations can go forward. So,
Yeah, I appreciate it. A long way to go. This is just the beginning.
yes.
But thank you very much.
Yes. Thank you. All right. So we'll follow up, and we have some great more sessions coming, and we'd love to see you at that. So, all right,
Appreciate it.
everybody. Thank you. And thank you to Charlie and Brittany for all the great work they do to make all this happen. So have a
Indeed.
good weekend. All right.
Cheers. Cheers.
Bye-bye.